U.S. history, welcome back to class. Okay, today we're starting to hit the Vietnam War, and this is the first part of what will eventually be a several part series of lectures on the Vietnam War. Now, so far in class this year, we've really hit four wars in this chunk of American history. Both World War I and World War II, we spent quite a bit of time on, and I think that's justified because the World Wars really kind of revamp and restructure the balance of power in the world. Then the Spanish-American War and the Korean War, man, if you took a nap for a day, you probably missed those because I didn't spend a ton of time on those, as they're smaller regional conflicts that really don't impact the overall theme and kind of momentum of history, although they're definitely important conflicts, and I don't want to minimize, the sacrifice veterans made in either one of those. Now, the Vietnam War, to just kind of give you a little heads up as to what you're in store for, this one I'm not going to spend as much time as like a World War II, but I'm going to spend more time on it than I would have on the Spanish-American War or the Korean War. So it'll kind of be in a middle zone. Now, these notes, I would recommend that if you are taking notes at home, like I recommend, you should enter these in your Cold War era notes. It definitely fits in. This is a smaller regional hot war within the whole unit of the Cold War. However, part of the reason I'm going to spend more time on Vietnam than, say, the Korean War, this one kind of transcends the Cold War in a cultural way, and Vietnam, unlike previous wars, becomes very controversial and debated within the American public, and it kind of transcends the Cold War and also affects and permeates the civil rights movement too. So it kind of can tie into both of those themes. However, it'll definitely be more well suited to fit in your Cold War era notes. Also, the Vietnam War, unlike the previous conflicts we've covered, it becomes really controversial. Initially, there is a ton of support for it within the American public, but as the war drags on, and this does end up becoming a very long conflict, there's kind of a gradual tipping point where eventually, by the end of it, the last few years of the war, a majority of Americans are ready for us to leave Vietnam and feel like, man, this was kind of a big mistake. And then we're going to get into talking too about what lessons have we learned or maybe not learned as a society from this experience. I have some interesting photos here. Over here, the two black and white ones. This is a girl that gets hit with napalm, which we'll talk about pretty soon, where she had horrible burns. I'll give you a follow-up, and we're going to dig into some of these very infamous photos that get run around the world as this conflict's heating up. Know that Vietnam, in general, just to tell you, kind of give you a description of what Vietnam is as a country. It's very, very hot, very humid, dense jungles. The people that live there, especially back in the 1950s and 60s, are for the most part kind of humble rice farmers. It's not like going in and fighting Japan or Nazi Germany. Okay, very, very different scenario. And I think going into this war, remember, 10 years before it, we had the Korean War go on, where we were trying to stop the spread of communism. We were enforcing the American policy of containment, contain communism where it's at. And we had successfully done that in Korea, where the communist North Koreans tried to invade the South, and we come in and beat them up a little bit. Eventually, the war turns out to be a stalemate. And then 70 years later, you still have a communist North Korea and a capitalist republic that's an American ally in South Korea. That essentially was our goal. We wanted a repeat of the Korean War in the Vietnam War. You have the same scenario where, you go look at a map of Asia from this time. The Soviet Union, Russia, is the big communist nation up in the northern part of Europe and Asia, and then down low in Asia in the southern part, India and then Australia, a different continent, had both been parts of the British Empire, and those are kind of like American or British capitalist allies. So again, just like in Korea, Vietnam is divided at the beginning of this war in a North communist part and a South part that is more capitalist and U.S. friendly. So that's going to be a repeat and a similarity to the Korean War. Now, I think an important thing, and this is an American history class, so I'm not going to go too deep into the history of Vietnam, but I think Most Americans, if you go back to the 1950s, 1960s, really prior to the Korean War, knew nothing about Korean history. And I think the same is true for Vietnam, that your average American knew nothing about the history of Vietnam or who they are as a people. Our only reason for getting involved over there was that we want to stop the spread of this evil communist ideology that has taken hold in the Soviet Union and now China, and it's seeming to like spread and try to infest the whole world. And we're trying to halt that advance of the communists. I think to our own detriment, we didn't learn enough about the history and culture of Vietnam, and that really does not serve us well in the conflict because there's a huge disconnect between kind of the American military and the American public and what's going on with the average people on the ground in Vietnam. So getting into that a little bit, a very, very quick brief history of Vietnam. So you go back, Vietnam has always been an independent country. They have their own culture and language, definitely influenced by China, just like Japan and Korea and Thailand and many of these other South and East Asian countries are. They have like a pictogram style language that looks kind of Chinese to us, but it's unique and different. And a common trend or repeating theme in Vietnamese history is throughout their history, they've always been kind of independent and wanted to have their own autonomy and be their own separate country. And constantly, bigger, stronger countries have come in and tried to conquer them. And over time, the Vietnamese people have always prevailed. They've beaten bigger and stronger enemies, even though sometimes it takes a couple generations. Sometimes it even took a couple hundred years. So if you go back to real ancient times, go back to the year 1200, the Mongols, which were a seemingly unstoppable force. They were the excellent archers that are riding around on horseback, and they're just beating the hell out of all the other big empires of that day and age. They essentially conquer all of China. They conquer the Khwarezmian Shah. That's like the empire that was in Persia. They conquer Russia and almost march into Europe. Nobody could really defeat the Mongols out on an open battlefield back in the year 1200. They were just maybe the most lopsided battles in all of history where they just cut through everybody. Well, there was two places that the Mongols had trouble and were not able to fully conquer and bring under their power. One was Japan. Remember, we talked about that history of Japan of never being invaded for thousands of years until America drops 2 atomic bombs at the end of World War II and get an unconditional surrender from them. Well, in the case of Japan, it wasn't that the samurai warriors were better than the Mongols, but it was geography, that when they tried to move those mounted warriors across that East China Sea, that, they had bad storms and they smashed up against the rocks and they weren't able to transplant or move their army over to Japan to fight. So geography kind of saved Japan. Now, Vietnam is attached to Asia. It's not an island nation or anything like that. But the Mongols also, I guess, had a ton of trouble trying to conquer and subdue the Vietnamese people because it's very dense jungle and it's not conducive to like horse warfare. You don't have like open fields to go charge across in the dense jungle where they could have the local people could have kind of more guerrilla style conflict. That didn't suit the Mongols very well. So even though they did come in and they won a few battles, they were never able to fully like conquer Vietnam. So that's kind of an impressive thing. And then for hundreds of years after that, China constantly, the Chinese Empire, tries to come in and dominate Vietnam. And at certain times in history, Vietnam was a Chinese territory and under the Chinese rule. But the Vietnamese always fiercely tried to fight for their independence and time again would push the Chinese out of there. Now, get to more modern times, to like the late 1700s, 1800s. That's the age of imperialism, where like the British, the French, the Dutch, the Germans, the Spaniards are conquering the world. And if you look at like Africa or Asia in the 1800s, pretty much all of the territories there were spoken for by one European nation or another. Now, the British had the biggest empire. The sun never set on the British Empire, like literally, and it's a metaphorical thing, but just describing how big it was, because they had colonies all around the globe. Well, the second biggest European empire was the French. And what was French Indochina, which Vietnam is in this like colonial region, that was brought under French dominion. Now, the Vietnamese tried to resist the French, but the problem with them was that, they are very old school. They don't have technology in their favor. They're fighting with blowguns and bows and arrows and spears and stuff. And the French come in fighting with like modern carbine rifles. And so technology is on the side of the Europeans in the 1800s. So French Indochina becomes a French colony. All right. Now the Vietnamese still kind of wanted their independence. They have a long history there too of trying to resist French rule. Well, World War II breaks out, and what happens to France? Remember, Hitler and the Nazis overrun France in a month. So that kind of creates a situation when the host country or the primary country in the empire goes down and is conquered, all of their colonies are up for grabs. Now, the Americans and British try to grab up as many French colonies as we can, but Hitler sends a message to his Japanese allies across the world and says, hey, I just kicked France's butt. Snap up any of their colonies you can out in Asia. So during World War II, Vietnam, what was French Indochina, becomes a Japanese colony. The Japanese come in and are just ruthless to the Vietnamese people. The Vietnamese, I guess, hated Japanese rule because the Japanese were so ruthless and mean to them. But then, of course, Japan gets conquered and defeated at the end of World War II, and it goes back to being a French colony. Well, that's when the Vietnamese start to smell an opportunity there. But one thing I want you to get from this slide, you don't have to write every single thing down. Just know Vietnam, it's a small country, kind of isolated in Southeast Asia, and they have a long history of resisting and repelling much bigger, stronger countries and trying to kick them out of their territory so that they can be independent. That's what I want you to get from this. And I don't think many Americans back in the 1960s really understood that about Vietnam. Now, the French eventually in the 1950s, about 10 years after World War II, this would be right a little bit after the time of the Korean War. That's when the French downfall really starts. And the French Empire is starting to crumble. They never really fully recovered from what had happened to them in World War II. So for about another 10 years after World War II, it is a French colony. But then Vietnamese, or the Viet Minh, which was the freedom fighter resistance group, they smell weakness here, and they actually end up winning a series of battles. But the final kind of coup de grace was at a place called Dien Bien Phu, this fortress town that the French thought was impervious. There was really only one road up to the fortress. But to give you an idea how determined the Vietnamese people are, the backside of this fortress was all cliffs. Okay. And the French thought it was impossible to ever move an army up the cliff of the side of this mountain. But over in a nighttime effort, the Viet Minh actually are able to crawl up and scale up the side of this mountain, and they do a sneak attack behind the French at Dien Bien Phu and wipe out all French force. Now, this conflict becomes very unpopular in France. And then there is a movement in France to say, to hell with this, pull our boys out of there. We're going to release this colony, let it be independent. At that point in history, this is kind of the mid 1950s, America is fully deadlocked in the Cold War with the Soviets. Whenever a colonial power leaves an area, that creates kind of a power vacuum. What's going to come in and replace it? Who's going to be the new dominant force? Which team are they going to go on at this point in history? Are they going to be on Team Communist with the Soviets, or are they going to be a capitalist democracy and be on Team America? Okay, so America is watching the situation quite close as the French decide to withdraw. This happens in Dwight Eisenhower, the old World War II general's administration. So the beginning of American involvement is actually in the 1950s, although we don't send an army in right away. Initially, we just send in military observers and advisors who are kind of keeping an eye on the situation. Key terms for you. Now, you should have already had this stuff in your notes. I've talked about it before. It was also in the book notes that you were supposed to jot down. So if you did do the book notes that I had assigned yesterday, that was kind of the intro point of this unit. You don't have to write these down again. I wanted to emphasize these because they totally play into this whole unit and what goes on with the Vietnam War. First one is the domino theory. This is a theory that, if you've ever played with dominoes as a kid, where you stack them all up and you knock one domino down and then they all start falling. Everybody's seen videos of stuff like that. Maybe you've done it yourself. It's essentially it's kind of a metaphor for what would happen in a region. Like if one country goes communist, then all the other countries are going to fall like dominoes. That's what America worried that would be the case in Southeast Asia. So as the French leave, their colony of French Indochina gets broken into several smaller countries. You have Vietnam, you have Cambodia, and you have Laos. Each one of those countries has a slightly different culture and language. And we were worried, like Vietnam actually splits into two countries, just like Korea had done, where the north part is right next to China, which is a communist country. That part of the country becomes communist. The southern part kind of resists that. They don't want to be a communist nation. Their political leaders and important people, they want to ally with America. They want capitalism and businesses coming in and a free market. So you have this rift where Vietnam divides into two halves, and then Cambodia and Laos, they're kind of in the mix. But we're worried that, okay, North Vietnam has become communist. If it's able to spread it to South Vietnam, then Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, all these other countries in the region would fall and go communist too. So that's kind of the concept behind the domino theory, and really kind of sums up kind of the root cause of why America starts to get involved there in the first place. Second big term I have for you, and we've talked about this before, is containment. That's an important term for the Cold War, where the official policy since the Truman gave his big speech to Congress in like 1947 or 48 was America was going to basically lead the free world, and we were not going to go in and start wars in places that were communist. We were not going to go in and try to, like, say, liberate Poland, a country we wanted on our side. Most of the Polish people wanted to be on our side, but the Soviets had that locked down, and that was part of their territory. So we knew if we went into a place like Poland, it would start probably a World War III. The same was true for China. We hated that China went over to the communist side, but we weren't ready to start a World War III by going in and liberating them. We were ready to go in and do armed conflicts to resist the spread of communism into new areas. Okay, so containment as a foreign policy a kind of component is just what it sounds like. We're trying to contain communism where it's at, and that's why we get involved in the Vietnam War, and we go in with really the same intentions we had in Korea, that we're going to protect South Vietnam from communism. We're going to go in there and back them up, teach them how to fight, and help them resist the spread of communism. So a couple little cartoons down here, but there kind of shows you the domino theory that, like, here's the Viet Cong, these communist guerrilla fighters, and if they can take all Vietnam, boom, 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 and the rest of those countries over in Southeast and South Asia would fall too. And then, like, here's a map that kind of shows, like, everything in the red over in Asia, that's communist territory. Creeping in right here is where North Vietnam is. If you follow my cursor, it's like, man, if Vietnam starts to go, it's going to spread and take out the rest of Asia too. And that was something we felt was worth fighting for. Okay, now key groups for you. Let me move my mug again. This is where we'll finish part one. But this is some very important vocabulary for you to understand the Vietnam War. Now, if you go back to the Korean War or World War II or World War I, those wars are not guerrilla conflicts. American soldiers, they know who they're fighting. Like in World War II, my grandpas were fighting dudes that had swastikas on their arms and were dressed in German uniforms. That's who we were fighting. It was pretty clear cut. Two conventional armies squaring off on a battlefield. The same is true in the Korean War, that we are fighting the communist North Koreans and the communist Chinese, and it was the American coalition army, and it's, two conventional armies squaring off fighting each other. Well, Vietnam is not quite like that. It gets way more complex because it is in a jungle, because the people, the local population, have no resources or factories or anything like that. They realize that if they go and try to fight America in a conventional war, they will get massacred. It won't work in their favor because America has an air force and missiles and rockets, and we have all the technology on our side. So they realize that if they're going to win this conflict, they're going to need to do it through unconventional means. And what that means is kind of have a guerrilla style conflict where hit and run tactics. Now, Viet Minh were the group that was fighting the French. So the Viet Minh, which is not talking about men over women, but it's spelled M-I-N-H. The Viet Minh That was the Vietnamese like independence group that had tried to break away and had successfully gotten rid of the French colonial rulers. Once the French are kicked out of there, they're like, all right, now we're our own independent country. But not for long, because America starts to come in and kind of stick its nose in their business. Now, we weren't trying to add it and make it a colony for us necessarily, but we were putting in bases and trying to influence their leaders to kind of keep them on our side. So by the time we're covering the Vietnam War, the troops that I need you to be most familiar with would be the NVA, which stands for the North Vietnamese Army. Some of the battles, especially some of the early ones in the Vietnam War, our soldiers are fighting against other uniformed communist troops from North Vietnam that are being supplied by China. They're fighting with like AK-47s and, they get grenades and equipment like that. And they're actually like uniformed soldiers. So that would be kind of the conventional part of the war, where it's two ground armies squaring off against each other. However, in 1965 and 66, kind of early on in the conflict, we beat up the NVA in a series of different battles. So they realized that, hey, we can't fight America on America's terms, that's not going to be too productive because they have all the advantages. So then they kind of switched tactics, and the NVA is still used. It's still going to be around. If you listen to some of the Vietnam veterans that I was able to interview, and I'm going to share that with you down the road, they do remember times where they were fighting the NVA and there were other uniformed soldiers. And typically when they would fight with them, they would show up in big numbers. They would be more organized. But most of the fighting our soldiers experience in the Vietnam War, and this is one of the tragedies of the war that makes it really frustrating for our soldiers, most of the time we're fighting the Viet Cong, also commonly called the VC. It's abbreviated. The VC, or the Viet Cong, is the communist guerrillas, which really, these guys could be not even guys. They could be anybody. The Viet Cong used women, they used children, they used old people, they did use young men too. And this becomes really frustrating for our soldiers because, they would mingle with the local South Vietnamese population and give kids candy and sometimes have good relationships going on. But then out of the blue, and you see countless stories of this, some kid comes up and they think they're coming in for candy, and that kid's got a bomb strapped to him, and boom, it blows up. Or they're some seemingly friendly old lady detonates a mine or something, and it blows an American soldier's leg off. So here's the problem with the Vietnam War. We often don't know who we're fighting. And the regular civilians we're trying to protect from communism can look just like the communist guerrillas who are trying to spread communism. So it becomes very, very frustrating. So make sure you add all of those terms into your notes with special emphasis on the NVA and the Viet Cong or VC. Okay? All right, that's all I got for you today. We'll be back soon with 2.